Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll make a start. You're all very welcome to this afternoon's Irish Studies Research Seminar from Queen's University Belfast, online through Teams. Thank you for joining us. For those of you unfamiliar with Teams, if you wouldn't mind, if you haven't done so already, just muting your microphone and keeping your microphone off during the presentation. That will stop us getting any feedback, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions later on. I'll tell you how to do that when we get there. Also, just to let you know, this session is recorded, so if you don't want to appear on the recording, just turn your camera off as well. Otherwise, you're very welcome to keep your camera on. So let me introduce this afternoon's speakers, well known to many people with us this afternoon. Professor Sean O'Connell is Professor of British and Irish Social History at Queen's University Belfast, and an authority on British and Irish social history in the 20th century, particularly relating to working class experience. He's published widely in that field, including a recently published monograph on the politics of consumer credit in the UK, 1938 to 1992, published in 2018. And he's currently completing a monograph for Palgrave Pivot on the history of joyriding. Dr Leanne McCormick is Senior Lecturer in Modern Irish Social History and Director of the Centre for the History of Medicine in Ireland, CHOMI, at Ulster University. And her research interests include women's history, the history of sexuality, and the history of medicine in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And her publications include Regulating Sexuality, Women in 20th Century Northern Ireland, published by Manchester University Press in 2010. And Sean and Leanne jointly led in 2019 a research project commissioned by the Department of Health in Northern Ireland to examine the history of mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries in Northern Ireland. And their research details the Northern Ireland experience of institutions that have provided so much concern and trauma in the Republic. And you can read the full report produced by the research team that they led on the Department of Health Northern Ireland website. And it's on a topic related to that project and to the Northern Ireland report they're going to talk to us about this afternoon. The title of the presentation, as you can see on the screen, is North and South Comparing the History and Legacy of the Mother and Baby Homes. So I'm going to pass over first to Sean, who will start us off on that subject.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks for inviting us to give this talk today. And it's very much a kind of our first attempt, really, at reflecting upon how our report and findings on mother and baby homes in Northern Ireland compares with the recent Commission on Mother and Baby Homes in the Republic. So we're going to talk today about the two sides of the research, both by that I mean archival research and oral history research in the two projects, and explain some of the major differences in the research process in the Republic and in Northern Ireland as far as we understand it. Also explaining maybe the differences between the institutions that were involved, in the different mother and baby homes in the two jurisdictions, and also finally then think about some of the ways in which evidence is presented and discussed in the two reports. So I'll speak about oral history, Leanne will speak about the archives, and Leanne's going to speak in a few minutes about the archives, and then I'll move on to oral history. But just to say a little bit about the origins of the project, Peter's already explained that both myself and Leanne were given a tender by the Department of Health to carry out the research. It was work that we felt we were well qualified to do. I've been an oral historian since the 1990s, and I've often worked around difficult oral histories, for example, around joyriding, as Peter mentioned. So that includes working with groups like Families Bereaved Through Car Crime, also working on difficult topics like the history of money lending, for example, and in working class communities with topics like deindustrialisation, urban redevelopment. So traumatic experiences in their own rights, but nothing that was as traumatic as the experiences we've been encountering in this research, as you'll be learning more about as we move along. And Leanne was particularly well qualified through her own expertise in looking at mother and baby homes and the history of Magdalen laundries in Northern Ireland, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. So we thought we would work well together as a team. And we worked with two researchers, Livy D and John Privilege, and on a budget of £186,000 and over 12 months. So that's very much a budget, if you like, when you compare it to the many millions of euros that were spent in the Republic on both the Commission on Mother and Baby Homes and on the previous McAleese report on Magdalen laundries. So we were overseen by an independent working group of civil servants with an independent chair. So part of the research which we're going to be talking about today is, or a little bit what we're going to talk about today, I guess, is reflecting upon the issues of working as commissioned historians, if you like. It's very much unlike anything that I've done before, certainly, and it certainly presents particular challenges. There also we faced scepticism from victims and survivors. So groups such as Birth Mothers for Justice Northern Ireland were initially at least concerned about our bona fides, I guess, and our appropriateness as researchers, and whether we were going to be independent as researchers. You know, were we dupes, if you like, who were just prolonging the process, delaying justice for victims and survivors? And they were all very understandable concerns that they had. Okay, so that says a little bit about the background to the research. I'm going to hand over then to Leanne, who's going to say something about the archival research and give you the background to these institutions, and then I'll come back and talk a bit more about the oral history, the oral testimony in the two reports.
Thanks, Sean. And I'm aware that for some of you, this will be very familiar territory. For others, it may not be so. So hopefully bear with me if you're already familiar with some of the material that I'm going to be speaking about. But what I want to do first of all is just to give you a brief overview of the different ways in which the homes were established, north and south. To talk a little bit about the archives and the records of the homes and the differences that we were experiencing, a little bit about the homes themselves, and then to finish with some discussion about the cross-border experiences before I'll hand back to Sean. So just in terms of the history of the sources, and also just to apologise because my children have just arrived in from school and I can hear them, so I'm hoping that you can't, but I am aware of them. So in terms of the establishment of the homes, there was a different pattern north or south, and we see that in the south really the majority of homes are established earlier than in the north, with, for example, the county homes been established in the years following partition, and those owned and run by the religious orders in the 1920s and 1930s. So, for example, the Sacred Heart homes with Bessborough in 1922, Sean Ross in 1931, and Castle Pollard in 1935. The Protestant-run Bethany home in 1921, and the Denny home, which had a longer history pre-partition existence, and then in Dunboyne, the Good Shepherd Sisters in 1955, and then other flatlets and hostels in later decades as well. So mostly established in the post-partition years of the 1920s and 30s. In Northern Ireland, it's sort of slightly different situation with more institutions been established in the pre-partition period. So, for example, Malone Place, Belfast Midnight Mission, in existence from the 1860s, but really from the first 2 decades of the 20th century, a focus on unmarried mothers, with the maternity home where unmarried mothers were giving birth. And similarly with the Salvation Army home, while a specific home for unmarried mothers was established in Thorndale in 1922, the Salvation Army had been taking in unmarried mothers and working with unmarried mothers was part of their general rescue work before this. Also Kennedy House, the Church of Ireland, was an amalgamation of the Church of Ireland Rescue League, which had been in existence from 1911, 1912, and was combined with the Church of Ireland Moral Welfare Home, which became Kennedy House in 1947. In terms of Catholic homes, the first Catholic home was established by the Legion of Mary in 1942, Mater Dei, a specific home for unmarried mothers. There was also a Regina Coeli home in Belfast, which worked more with women who were suffering from alcohol problems or homeless, unlike the home in Dublin, which did admit unmarried mothers as well. There was a specific separate one in Belfast. And Hope Dean, which was established in 1943, which was a non-denominational Protestant home, very similar in its management to the Bethany home, with a Protestant non-denominational management committee, but with very strong links to the Church of Ireland Moral Welfare Society and the Church of Ireland Adoption Society. And then we have the Good Shepherd Sisters establishing Marianville in Belfast in 1950 and Marianvale in Newry in 1955. So clearly, again, with the work in Dunboyne in 1955, the Good Shepherds becoming involved in work with unmarried mothers in the 1950s. In addition, we do have the workhouses, which continue to operate in Northern Ireland in a limited form until 1948 and the establishment of the NHS. And as we flag in the report, the numbers of unmarried mothers given birth in the workhouse or having their children boarded out from the workhouses are not included in the report, as we weren't able to determine the numbers in the available time that we had. As any of you who've used these records will know, they are extensive. And like the records for the county homes across the border, the details for unmarried mothers are included with all the admissions. So would need to be manually extracted. And that wasn't something that was possible for us to do in the time that we had. But hopefully with any further inquiries in the area that we will be able to learn more about the experiences of mothers and the outcomes for children within the workhouse system. So both North and South, there was a clear, more of a Protestant explicit engagement with unmarried mothers pre-partition. But in Northern Ireland, we can clearly see, particularly for Catholic homes, it's the 1940s and 50s where those homes were established. We do see that both North and South authorities were very keen to see that there are homes for relevant denominations, and discussions about keeping Denny House going in the 1970s are very similar to the same discussions that we have about regarding Hope Dean in the 1980s and about the need to continue to offer provision across the denominations. One of the major differences in the process of writing the reports, North and South, was about access to records. The Commission in the South obviously had statutory powers. All records were brought in centrally and digitised. We didn't have statutory powers, and we relied on goodwill and negotiation to access records. And we do detail in the report the various processes that we went through about accessing conditions, about accessing records and the different conditions that we had to do that under. So while we were able to digitally photograph records for Mater Dei and Hope Dean and Thorndale, 6 months into the project, we were negotiating access to records that held by the Good Shepherd Sisters, which we looked at in a solicitor's office, and we couldn't photograph but had to manually record details. And this, as you can imagine, was a very slow process, and we had to make decisions to sample material because it just simply wasn't possible to record everything. And at this point, I'd just like to say how fantastic the researchers on the project were. John Privilege was the researcher on the archival side of the project, and he ended up in all sorts of places. Some he'd rather not have ended up on the trail of records and trying to track things down. And we were so fortunate in John and Livy D, who came on board as the oral historian, but again was redeployed from oral history to work on the Good Shepherd records when we needed to get as much of that done as possible, and also photographed the Thorndale records as well. When the report was published, they often referred to the researchers or the research team from Ulster and Queen's, and it sounded as if there was a sort of huge team working away in the background, when the reality was it was a max of 4 and for a year and a bit, and then down to 2 again. But just to say, there are two main points about the records that I'd like to make. And one is that the records that we saw, either because that's all that existed, or that all we were given access to, differ considerably from what exists or what was provided to the Commission in the South. So, for example, the Dunboyne home, which was run by the Good Shepherd Sisters, the Commission list the list of records they saw, which was over 2,000 scanned pages. Other than records of admissions, departures, births, entry and exit pathways, there were extensive financial information, audited accounts down to the level of cash books, correspondence with local authorities, as well as internal Good Shepherd documentation, annals of the convent chapter books, which were required to be kept in all the Good Sisters, Shepherd Sisters locations, donations, report of council meetings, various accounts of the history of the institutions. We saw for the mother and baby homes, entrance registers and case files. Sometimes those had correspondence attached to them, but sometimes they didn't, and generally very brief in material. Little snippets of financial information. So we saw one book maybe covering a few years for Marion Veal, but we didn't see any internal documentation or correspondence, no annals of the convent or the chapter books that had been required to be kept. And given that religious orders did follow common practices in record keeping, it is surprising that none of this information was available. Similarly, for the Bethany home, which was managed as I said, in a similar way to Hope Dean, and Hope Dean did have an annual meetings and annual reports as well, and this managed Summer Management Committee. Some of the Hope Dean records were lost in a fire, but for Bethany home, meetings of the Management Committee were held by the Church of Ireland RCB Library. There don't appear to be any such records that exist for Hope Dean. And hopefully, again, perhaps if there are statutory powers attached to an inquiry, that may be able to identify more of this material in the future. And secondly, and related to this issue as well, was that the Commission was able to digitise records. And while there is discussion and concern and debate about access to this archive, for Northern Ireland, no such archive exists. And we did have grave concerns, and again, it's raised in the report about the condition and the care of records and where they're held. Other than those held by PRONI, it's only the records of the Salvation Army which are held in proper archival conditions. So some of the records of Hope Dean, as I had mentioned before, were destroyed in a fire, with no copies of records made. For a number of homes, it's concerning because they are vulnerable to being lost or destroyed or a fire. And while a letter has been sent out to record holders about the importance of preservation and care of records, there does need to be more done. Records, for example, have disappeared over time, and those used, for example, by Chris Shepherd in an article in 2009 about Mater Dei, couldn't be found whenever we were looking for them. And I know John was searching in filing cabinets and trying to track them down, and nobody had any idea where they'd been, and they aren't held with other Mater Dei records. I had looked at records relating to the Church of Ireland Rescue Home in Church of Ireland House in Belfast. Those records seem to have gone as well. They're not with the other records, and they may be somewhere else. They may have been held by other individuals, but it is important that they are collected and hopefully digitised and preserved in the future and held in appropriate archival conditions. Just to speak briefly about the institutions themselves, as we said, they have a different form of establishment, and what we see in Northern Ireland, that we don't have those very large institutions that we see in the Republic. So homes such as Sean Ross or Castle Pollard, who were taking in about 140 admissions a year, the numbers in Northern Ireland are much more like the smaller southern institutions. And we don't have total overall numbers to kind of offer a comparison there. But generally what we do see is a very similar profile of women who enter the homes, and the changes sort of through the decades and the increasing number of, for example, students and the change in professions by the 1960s. In terms of age as well, It's slightly different, and our calculations were taken slightly differently in that we looked at the sort of age range 20 to 29 and then under 19s, where the Commission looked at under 18s and then 18 to 29. We have a third of all admissions who are under 19, and those under 18 for the Commission are at about 11%. I'm not sure if that year makes that much of a difference, but overall, the proportions are similar in that over 90% of all admissions were to both North and South were under 30. In terms then of experiences in the home, and again, sort of racing through this very quickly, but one of the key differences was the length of time of stay in the homes for both mothers and children. Now, this did vary in homes in the South, but generally women were staying for longer periods of time and did in particular stay longer after giving birth. In homes in Northern Ireland, women rarely stayed longer than 6 weeks in mother and baby homes after giving birth if they did return to the home. And that was the time period for consent forms to be signed for consent for adoption. And this was often the timescale then that was being worked towards about a decision to do what to do with a baby. And the second key difference is unaccompanied children, whereas in homes in the South, children would often stay sometimes for a number of years after their mother had left. We don't see that in Northern Ireland. Mothers and babies didn't stay in the homes without each other. So when a baby left, so did a mother, and vice versa. The more similar situation, the Northern Irish homes more in common with the Bethany or Denny homes, where children more often went to institutions rather than staying in the mother and baby home or being fostered and adopted. And in Northern Ireland, our figures indicate that at least a third of babies were placed in institutions on leaving a mother and baby home. And this could be higher as we only have the initial destination on exit. And this impacts on our knowledge, particularly about infant mortality rates in Northern Ireland, one of the key issues that we were last asked to look at, and obviously one of the huge concerning factors that does emerge from the Commission's report and the very high infant mortality rates. In Northern Ireland, as babies only stayed for relatively short periods of time in mother and baby homes, there does need to be further research, again, as we flagged in the report, on the baby and children's homes they were placed in to determine what infant mortality rates did look like. At the end of the research, we asked for a short extension of time to look at the baby homes, and we have included a chapter in the report where we looked at St Joseph's Baby Home, which was run by the Nazareth Sisters on their site at the top of the Ormo Road, just across the road from Marionville. And the initial figures that we looked at and work previously carried out by the Detail do raise concerns about infant mortality and care of children there, and additional research on the other homes will allow for a better understanding, to know what happened to children, to know about infant mortality rates, to know whether things like vaccine trials, for example, took place. And just to finish up my section, to talk a little bit about the cross-border aspects. These for us were some of the most puzzling and difficult to negotiate aspects of writing the report. I think it's clear to say that for many people who were involved in running mother and baby homes, the border was of no relevance. And in some ways this does relate to the fact that for all religious denominations, they operated on an all-island capacity, both Protestant and Catholic. In terms of women from Northern Ireland going into homes in the South, the numbers varied, but they were often around about 1% in most of the local authority or Catholic religious run homes. The numbers for the Protestant run Bethany and Denny homes were higher at about 10% in total, which is similar to the numbers for women from the South in Northern Irish homes. Interestingly, for the in Stranowler County Home in Donegal, where it might be expected that numbers would be higher for women from Northern Ireland, there were only 10 women with a Northern Irish address, so not quite 1% of admissions. There was more movement, though, the other way around, with women going from the Stranowler County Home to the Magdalen Laundry run by the Good Shepherd Sisters in Derry. And the Commission's report indicated that about 20 women had gone that direction, but they sort of suggested that as they only had outcomes for about 16% of women, it was likely to be higher. And our research does show that there were at least 83 women going from the county home in Stranraer to the Magdalen Laundry in Derry. Numbers were also higher for Northern Ireland addresses whenever the castle opened in Newton Cunningham in 1982, which was a hostel for unmarried mothers more than a traditional mother and baby home. And that continued to operate into the 21st century. And 13 out of the original 28 women who were admitted were from Northern Ireland. And there was a suggestion that the home would be jointly funded by what was then the Western Health and Social Services Board in Northern Ireland and the North West Health Board across the border, but a formal agreement couldn't be reached. From some of the limited financial records that we have from Marion Vale, they do record how they did bill the relevant health boards in the Republic for when women were in Marion Vale. However, there was also quite a bit of creative accounting going on regarding some women who had entered Marion Vale, really what seems to be to ensure that no one in their local area was aware of their situation. So their records would note how it had been arranged that payment would be made via the Good Shepherd Sisters in Dunboyne, where a number rather than a name would be used, and then obviously that money would be claimed sort of go back to Marion Vale. And clearly using a home across the border was seen as an option for increased secrecy. Babies born to mothers from the south sometimes had a prior arrangement with an organisation such as St Patrick's Guild or the Catholic Protection and Rescue Society Ireland. Then babies were taken back to Dublin after they were born. In other cases, they were placed in institutions or fostered or adopted in Northern Ireland if they didn't return home to their mothers. There didn't seem to be any particular pattern to what happened to those babies. What we do see is that there is, the Commission's report also then identified a number of adoptions from homes in the south to Northern Ireland. For most of the homes, these are relatively small. The highest number was from Castle Pollard with 29 adoptions and 6.6 of the adoptions from there. Now, oddly, the statistical analysis in the report for Bethany and the Denny homes suggests that no children were adopted to Northern Ireland. However, the discussion in those chapters does refer to children being escorted over the border by members of the Salvation Army, and there are individuals whose stories do reveal that children were adopted from the Bethany home to Northern Ireland. So there's somewhat of a confusing story really about that. But there clearly is more movement north to south of babies rather than south to north, and we have identified at least 500 babies moving cross border. The majority from the Catholic run homes, Marionville, Mater Dei, and a smaller number from Thorndale, and there may well be more. One of the main destinations was the baby home run by the Nazareth Sisters in Fawn in County Donegal. It had moved from Derry during World War II and stayed there after the end of the war. And it was the baby home for the Derry Diocese, and which covered both sides of the border. And children of mothers who were born in the Derry Diocese were often placed there. But it was on the other side of the border, so essentially in a different jurisdiction. And we spent a lot of time and a lot of legal advice about how these movements might be legal. The key factors seemed to be whether the movement was for the purposes of adoption, which in many cases it was. Sometimes babies were adopted in the Republic, sometimes they were adopted in Northern Ireland. So babies could move across the border and then back again. And if you know where Fawn is, you'll know that it's not very far over the border, but it is still over the border. And it makes things more complicated in identifying what happened to children, and for those individuals trying to find out about their past as well. And the other most popular destination was to the Sisters of St Clair and Stamullen, County Meath. And again, as we said in the report, it's difficult to explain this movement. The Commission report in the South does identify links between the Good Shepherd Sisters in Dunboyne and Stamullen. So this may well have been part of a wider Good Shepherd links with this home. Stamullen has also been associated with adoptions in the US, and there are a number of babies who were born in homes in Northern Ireland who were then subsequently adopted in the US via Stamullen. It's unclear, for example, if it was easier to acquire a new birth certificate in the Republic for a baby born in Northern Ireland, where you're not having to get a duplicate certificate, one doesn't already exist. And the complexities of birth registration are illustrated in one of the cases in the report of an individual who ended up with a Northern Irish birth certificate and then 2 birth certificates from the Republic prior to adoption in the US. But it's clear that movements of women and children were moved freely across the border without any seeming concern for any legal considerations, and this does raise a number of questions. And as with a number of issues, more inquiry into these institutions and more of a cross-border approach than has been taken so far may tell us more about these stories. Thank you, and I'll hand over back to Sean again.
Thanks, Leanne. So I'm taking us back to the territory of oral history then. So as has been observed by researchers in the Republic, collecting oral history on this subject is vital because of the restrictions placed on the archival records relating to mother and baby homes, which in effect has made them, the homes, and the women who were placed within them, invisible. The oral history element of the research was finalised following a careful appraisal of research design options, and that included contacting people like Catherine O'Donnell at UCD, who'd previously worked on similarly traumatic oral history projects. We also, as I mentioned earlier, sought help early on from Birth Mothers for Justice, because any oral history project will also seek assistance from its target audience, if you like, in terms of project design. However, they were understandably suspicious of the project. This made it hard to build up the kind of trust which is central to all oral history endeavours. And I think the decade of inquiries that preceded our own work hadn't helped in terms of building up that trust. So, see, for example, the McAleese report on Magdalene laundries in the Republic, and where you have to look until chapter 17 before you reach any oral history, where you reach the testimony of the victims and survivors of the Republic's laundry system. And even then, it's a disjointed collection of sound bites from unidentifiable individuals. If you're looking north of the border, if you look at the Hart inquiry into institutional historical abuse, research tells us that many of the people who came forward to speak to the inquiry felt that they were re-traumatized by the legalistic approach that was taken to hearing narrators' accounts. So 47% described the process as traumatic or abusive. And furthermore, delays in acting upon the Hart inquiry didn't help in the context of our own research project. We were arriving to carry out this research at a time when Hart had not been acted upon, and there was no sense that Hart was about to be acted upon at that point in time. So from the victims and survivors' perspective, were we useful dupes? Were we somehow being used by a duplicitous bureaucracy, perhaps? Now, we ourselves were not completely naive about any of this, I guess, and our greatest fear was that we would record a number of traumatic interviews, forcing people to come forward to give us their stories, and then they would never go anywhere. Maybe Stormont would collapse again, for example. Any of the things that maybe somebody would create an Irish sea border. Who knows what might happen that would get in the way of the dissemination of the material that we were recording. So at that point, we got a commitment from the Department of Health that we could create a website that would be a space on which the oral testimony, or at least the oral testimony of those who consented, could appear in transcript form at least. And this was our kind of fallback option in terms of the concerns that we had that maybe the research might eventually go nowhere for reasons beyond our control. And this also then fed into our fears around what might happen in terms of the oral testimony, fed into our approach to how we wrote the report as well. If any of you have consulted it, I'm sure some of you have, you will have seen the extent to which we have included the testimony and very heavily contextualized testimony within the report. So that was something that we really wanted to do. We wanted the voices of those who spoke to us to be upfront and central within the report. Now, readings on work on trauma and oral history were also central to the planning. We concluded that it was most likely that the chances of re-traumatization of interviewees would be reduced by highlighting the extent to which these interviews contributed to a more complex and accurate historical narrative about sexual mores, the state, religion, and society. And this approach was designed to reassure the research participants, to signal empathy to them, and to overcome the barriers that prevent many narratives of traumatic experience from reaching the public. As such, experiences produce shame, anger, often guilt in the victim, and are regarded as secrets rather than as stories to tell. In an essay on difficult oral histories, the eminent oral historian Sean Fields questions the notion that an oral history interview is either inherently healing or re-traumatizing. He argues that both perspectives underestimate the individual interviewee's agency in the process. Field concludes that the oral historian must emphasize the agency that survivors can experience through regenerative memory work. This involves creating democratic spaces in which narrators can express their diverse experiences and perspectives and reflect on difficult topics. In such a context, the interviews are no longer about reliving traumatic experiences only. They are also about producing empowering spaces. So this was the academic view. The issue can be viewed very differently by civil servants, and certainly by anyone trying to defend institutions challenged by this type of oral testimony. And ultimately, a robust defence had to be made of oral history within our report and its ability to provide representative evidence. Of course, 60 testimonies are reflective of only a fraction of the many thousands of individuals who passed through the institutions that we analysed. And if the intention was to create scientific samples of informants from each of the homes, the Department of Health would have needed to create a very different project, one that involved the construction of surveys or structured interviews perhaps. Moreover, it would have been necessary to overrule any concerns about privacy and confidentiality by setting out to identify a sample that was deemed to match the age, religious and socio-economic characteristics of the girls and women who passed through the doors of the mother and baby homes. A portion of those identified in this fashion would then have had to be contacted with a request to participate. An approach of this nature would have been highly questionable ethically. Moreover, many oral historians argue that while such an approach might identify a more representative group of informants, it offers findings that are of an intrinsically lower quality. Structured interviews or questionnaires in this type of large sample approach are best suited to broad social surveys, rather than the collection of emotional and deeply personal testimony. Oral historians are much more likely to adopt a semi-structured interview approach. This involves the adoption of an interview schedule that identifies the key themes to be addressed during each interview, while also allowing a great deal of scope for the interviewee to offer their testimony in their own pace and structure. The informant-centred oral history interview also carries the advantage of providing alternative perspectives on historical events to those found in the official sources written by those in positions of authority. So our interviews rolled out across late 2018 and early 2019, and they featured a great deal of testimony that appears to equate to the types of the testimony that the Commission was receiving also. As I said, we had 60 interviews in total. The Commission had 195 hearings in total, that included former residents, advocacy groups, sisters and members of congregations, experts, social workers, local authority officials, government officials, family members, priests, guards, and others. It's interesting to note what's said in the Commission's report around training. The training that that was received seems to have focused around preserving confidentiality, and I think that maybe represents the a very different approach to the way that perhaps we were looking at the training, which was more around re-traumatization. I'm not saying that the Commission didn't think about that, they clearly did, but you know, the report of the Commission itself flags up confidentiality as its key element, it seems, in the training. In terms of the way they operated, one member of the Commission seems to have acted as interviewer whilst a researcher took notes at each of the meetings. And as you will know, there's been subsequently outcry within the Republic around what eventually then happened to those recordings. First, they seem to have been deleted, and then they seem to have been rediscovered. There's also been controversy over some of the terms and phrases around the use of the oral testimony in the Commission's final report. Terms such as the contamination of some evidence by particular witnesses, for example, or claims that some of the material that was offered by witnesses was clearly incorrect. So some of this language may reflect the differences between a different type of historical approach. Certainly those are not terms that will be found by somebody who was predominantly trained as an oral historian, I would argue. And some of the ways in which the material is presented in terms of the Commission's report reflects and bears similarity to the use of survivors' testimony in McAleese, I would argue. In some respects, the testimony is somewhat disjointed. When I was reading it, I still found myself asking, who are these people? I don't mean by that, who are they? I mean, give me a sense of who this is speaking, give me a sense of their trajectory, you know, how did they relate their story, what was the chronology of their accounts. So here's an example, if you want to put up the next slide, Leanne. So I'll let you have a read of that, but you know, in some respects it's rich. It's certainly richer than McAleese. It offers a lot more information than McAleese, but it offers it still in a boiled down way, with the interviewee not having any kind of control in any respect over, I think, the way in which it is structured. We can reflect on this perhaps in questioning. So I'm going to show the next slide, Leanne. Whereas I think here's an example of you know, it's a short quote. It's not War and Peace from this particular individual, but I think that you can see in allowing the interviewees to speak for themselves more in a historical report, even if it's a commissioned historical report, you can still allow a sense of emotion, the embodied emotion, the embodiment of trauma to come through in the interviewee's words. I think it's important to allow the interviewees to speak for themselves, and that's something that we really fought to do in the report. Okay, it's clear that the Commission heard a lot of testimony that was like the testimony that we received. There was depressingly large amounts of testimony around sexual assaults, for example, resulting in pregnancy. So that clearly highlights the way in which one tragedy was piled upon another personal tragedy for the girls and women who were involved in these, or the victims of these sexual assaults, who then were placed in mother and baby homes. Lots of testimony in both the reports about sexual ignorance. Lots of testimony about the role of Catholic priests, in particular in placement. Lots of testimony about the terror and pain of childbirth, women being and girls being left alone to have their babies, often without pain relief, particularly the further we go back in history, or little preparation in terms of antenatal classes within the homes. Like ourselves, the Commission also heard testimonies that were more, to use their term, positive. So such as one of a 21-year-old, or a witness who at 21 found herself pregnant by her boyfriend. This was in the 1970s, but who wanted to offer a positive story using words such as refuge or sanctuary or haven to describe the mother and baby home that she went into. And certainly we had a number of individuals amongst our interviewees, particularly who were in the Good Shepherd homes, who offered similar phraseology and similar perspectives on their experience of the homes. And we would have liked to have speculated more on this issue in our report, but historical speculation was something that we were kind of reined in on to an extent, particularly in the context of lawyers and others hovering around the report. So interestingly, the Commission echoes some of our own thoughts on these issues, speculating on the role of class and education of particular individuals and how they then experience life in the homes. Perhaps higher social status, a greater experience of education provided a basis for better relationships with individual nuns. There were also factors around the religiosity of particular individuals and commitment to religion, and even long-term relationships with the baby's fathers, which seem to have impacted upon the way in which individuals certainly offered potentially different testimony to us. At the other end of the spectrum, even a mother and baby home or even a Magdalene laundry could be a haven when home for some of these individuals was the site of incest or other forms of abuse. So both the Commission and our report provide a grim testimony on this particular ugly topic. In terms of adoption and consent, I would suggest that the Commission has stronger testimony on this, possibly because they have more testimony on this from a number of workers who've been assigned to mother and baby homes in professional capacities during the 70s and 80s in particular. And they told the Commission about a culture of adoption that was prevalent in mother and baby homes, voicing their opinion that this culture was systematic and a belief system. It was harder for us to make this kind of conclusion from the basis of having only 3 social workers to cite on these issues, and they were the 3 social workers we spoke to offered 3 slightly different perspectives actually, so it was difficult then to come to firm conclusions around that from that professional observer classification, if you like. Okay, so we've kind of raced through a number of big issues here, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, so I just want to offer a few quick conclusions, if you like, some takeaway messages from today, and perhaps they centre around the concept of evidence, what form it takes, the access to it, its preservation, the need to preserve what's out there now quickly before it's destroyed, and the need to debate how different forms of evidence might sit in a hierarchy. So the nature of this difficult and complex evidence that we've presented to you, both in form of what was in the Commission's report and what we unearthed ourselves in our report, can be viewed by, and particularly in terms of the oral history, can be viewed by some as a way of questioning the oral history, questioning its usefulness as evidence or even its existence as evidence. So the Commission in the Republic was criticised for comments about having no evidence in certain areas where its own oral testimony appeared to contradict that. So clearly it would appear official Irish historical inquiries have a problem in terms of recognising victim and survivor testimony as evidence. So in our report and in the Maxwellisation process leading up to its publication, which is a process where the chapters that name a particular organisation are sent to that organisation for scrutiny, and scrutiny by their lawyers as well in some cases, you know, we argued that while extensive academic arguments can be developed about the nature of memory, what is remembered, what is forgotten, or how individual memory operates in tandem with forms of collective memory, these should not be deployed to fundamentally undermine oral testimony, at least not without an equally challenging critique of archival records that are themselves the product of an individual sitting down many decades ago to craft their own short notes or assessment of a young pregnant woman, resident perhaps in the Salvation Army's Thorndale House or in one of the Good Shepherd mother and baby homes. In popular understanding, the memory that these archival sources are often understood to provide, in popular understandings, the memory that these archival sources are often understood to provide evidence in a more reliable category than oral testimony. Many historians view that as a highly contagious claim. The work of renowned oral historian Lynn Abrams makes this point cogently. So let you have a quick read of that. That basically makes the point for where oral history should sit in the hierarchy of evidence. And finally, it's important to add, moreover, that in our inclusion of a large amount of oral evidence, we did not produce a straightforwardly one-sided account that simply offered the mirror image of archival records. It included the viewpoints of nuns, of social workers, and even some birth mothers, as I've already said, who offered numerous perspectives on a complex past, a past whose complexity we've only been able to scratch the surface of in this short presentation. And we are sure that in the Q&A, you'll all help us to begin digging deeper. So thank you for listening. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Sean and Leanne, thank you so much for that insightful and very clear presentation. I'm sure there will be many questions. So what we're going to do is move straight into a question and answer session. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you look at your Teams screen towards the top, you should see a little icon with a hand or a hand and a face. If you click on that, that will just indicate that you want to ask a question. Then I'll invite you to unmute yourself and put your question to Sean and Leanne. So I can see, first of all, Patrick Corrigan and is up. So Patrick, over to you first.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Sean and Leanne, both for an excellent presentation and for a really valuable research report, which I think has brought us a huge step forward. Listen, my question is this. It's really reflecting on your experience as researchers, trying to access documents, records, witnesses as well, and you talked about that in your presentations. Do you have any reflections on what may be the need for the Irish government to pass legislation or empower the coming Northern Ireland inquiry to be able to access records and witnesses based in the Republic? I mean, you reflected on the fact the institutions operated on an all-Ireland cross-border basis. Many of the headquarters and personnel and records may also be located across the border. And I know we had this experience with the HIA inquiry, where when they were looking at Concora, they needed to be able to access records in London, but they didn't have the powers, and they never got the powers to be able to actually compel that. Anyway, I was just wondering about your reflections on that, so that this coming inquiry can be one that survivors will have confidence in.
I'll have a quick go at that, and maybe Leanne might want to jump in as well. I mean, I forgot to say at the end, the next stage of the research now, we've kind of handed the baton over to Maeve O'Rourke and Phil Scraton. So, you know, two excellent people, I'm sure you'll agree, Patrick, who are thinking about how this process will work and what legislation will be needed to do that very difficult job of following the paper trail across the borders and, you know, sometimes within the UK, as you've said. So I think, you know, and Phil at the moment is chairing a Haldane committee inquiry into inquiries. So, you know, he really is the right man, I think, to think about this. I mean, I don't think it's maybe Leanne has more of a sense of what might be needed for this. I don't think I've particularly got the qualifications to answer that one, to tell you the truth, Patrick.
I think in terms of archives, this is something that we has been raised and discussed, and I know there has been some discussion at some sort of governmental levels about the fact that it is going to be necessary to access. What has sort of come from that, or what is going to come from that, I don't know, but I think definitely in terms of, for example, in particular adoptions, that those records are across the border with adoption agencies, with homes where babies went to. You know, we can sort of have a limited trail, but we don't know what has happened, and in terms of birth registrations and all sorts of things. So I think that there does have to be particularly for the records, there does have to be some kind of collaboration and some way of being able to access those records for the story to be told as well. And again, I suppose the other way, moving south to north too, but absolutely there will have to be that sort of cross-border collaboration, and the ability to access records is really important.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. Next question is from Murray Cohen.
Good day. Certainly that was an excellent presentation. As a trauma specialist here in Canada, my question is, what percentage of the 60 women interviewed had pursued mental health involvement over the years for chronic mental health issues, if there's any sense of that?
It's a very good question. I think I should say that the 60 interviews is interviewees in total. So, you know, not all of the 60 interviewees were birth mothers. Certainly in large numbers of the interviews, people are discussing the psychological damage that has been done to them by these circumstances, and that includes even those who came forward to offer, if you like, positive testimony or more positive testimony about, you know, those who found that the mother and baby home that they were in was a haven, or it allowed them a place in which to reflect or to maybe escape from an angry father, you know, who was angry that they were bringing shame to the family by their pregnancy. So I'd have to go and have a look at the interviews to answer that question. I'd say the majority of the women that we had spoken to have had significant mental health issues as a result of it, certainly. But I'd have to go and, you know, do the count, as it were, for that one, Maury.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Murray. Liam, you're next.
Excuse me. Hello, Leanne and Sean. I was wondering, as wonderful presentation, and you've made enormous progress on a very limited budget. I was wondering about the fathers or putative fathers in all of this. I would imagine they don't appear to any great extent in the written archives, but oral history clearly is one avenue through which you could reach. Do you envisage sometime in the future, if you got more funding or whatever, of filling in that other side of the gender divide, as it were?
Just to say that they do make sort of fleeting. We get fleeting glimpses in the archives. For example, the records of the Salvation Army home for the 1920s, 1930s have a little sort of on some of the records, a little insert, a little page where they do detail who the putative father was, and if any attempt at sort of contacting him and getting any child support had been made. I mean, generally what the answer was that, you know, either they couldn't be found, and they claimed no knowledge at all of the situation. So there was very little success in tracking down these putative fathers, but that is recorded. And in the records of a number of the homes, they will record who the putative father is. Sometimes, and again, sometimes there is reference to their involvement, that they are sometimes paying some child support. Sometimes there is contact between them. Sometimes that contact is being discouraged. So that there is sort of a whole, you know, it's sort of fleeting at times. In some records we have no reference at all to it, but there is that sense that they are there. I suppose it is a sort of nearly an untold story about those sort of fathers, and it's a very different experience for in lots of the situations as well. But yet the Salvation Army for those couple of early decades are quite interesting in that sort of where they were very much pushing to identify those fathers.
Thanks.
Okay. Do we have? Sorry, Sean. Go on.
Just to add quickly to that, we would have loved to have interviewed birth fathers to hear, what they had to say for themselves. Since the report has been published, I've had a conversation with one birth father who offered quite an interesting perspective, in that his claim is that he was warned off by the family when his girlfriend became pregnant, and that he very much wanted to have contact with the child that came of this pregnancy, but was warned off and is now unable to contact his birth child because he has no rights as he sees it and as it's been explained to him. So we may be, for example, we might be doing some more interviewing in the summer, actually, and in that case it would be great to interview him and others like him, definitely.
Well, thanks.
Thanks, Liam, for the question. Do we have more questions? Please just press the little hand icon or shout out if that isn't coming up for you. Just while I'm waiting for someone else to put up their hand up, Sean and Leanne, I mean, you mentioned, Sean, obviously the constraints of having an oversight committee of civil servants looking over your shoulder, legal constraints on what you could or could not do with the report. I mean, to what extent do you feel that your freedom as historians was constrained in, and how much of this can you talk about? Do you feel you had sufficient freedom to carry out the project as you originally intended, or were those constraints such that you feel that the final report doesn't reflect your original hopes for this project?
Do you want to go first with that, Leanne?
No.
Okay. I think in some respects it probably made it a better report, in that we were challenged to do certain things. For example, we always had to find at least 2 examples of things taking place, if you like, before we could demonstrate that this was a pattern, if you like. So it made us, it certainly it's given me a great case study for teaching oral history and the importance of oral history and oral history as evidence, because I had to fight like hell to defend oral history. And the fact that we only had 60 interviewees, this was deemed to be, of the 10,000 plus women, you've only found 60, or not all of them are even birth mothers. So we had to go a long way to defend oral history and how it can be used as evidence, and compare it with, the deeply flawed archival evidence, which was not challenged at all, because that's what people write down in files. So it must have been true. It's on paper. And the other aspect, I think, was that possibly helped us, although we'll never know this, is that after we started the research, very soon afterwards, the independent working group's chair resigned due to ill health. So that meant that really we more or less finished writing before they got themselves a new chair and called us back in for another meeting. So really what this meant was that we got on with it and just did it ourselves, and I think we, for example, when we pushed to do the work on the baby homes that weren't part of the initial research, we actually pushed into areas where we weren't expected to go. So it was a difficult push at times, and it was very frustrating at times. But I think I can honestly say, I think Leanne can differ with this, that there's nothing that was taken out that we wanted to be there, that was absolutely vital, that it needed to be there. Some things we had to take out to protect some of the people who'd spoken to us, because they might well have been sued or whatever, or because they were they were telling us things that had happened that didn't happen directly to them, so it was more difficult as evidence for us to include it. There were 1 or 2 pieces that were a bit like that, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I don't think there was. I think sometimes there were things that we thought might have been removed or asked to be removed that weren't. And again, I think I absolutely agree that there were things that I think perhaps as historians we took for granted that we could say without without explanation or without justification, that it did push us into having to strengthen things and strengthen the points and arguments. And I think we were able to do that, and the end result was better for us. But it was a very difficult procedure at times, and it was a very different way, I suppose, of working than we were used to, and some of the things that which in academic writing we would have been able to say, the language we would have been able to use without even thinking twice about it, we were having to sort of, you know, deliberate over and have to justify why we use particular terms or particular words as well. So a very different way of working and a different process, but at the same time, you know, I don't think the report was sort of dramatically altered, or we had to sort of do any dramatic changes, sort of less than perhaps we thought initially we might need to.
Okay, thank you both. I see Clara wants to ask a question, so over to you.
Hi there. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentations. I really appreciate that. It's such important work you're doing. So I have two questions. One question relates to the difference in terms of the length of stay. You mentioned that in Northern Ireland, the babies and the women stayed for much shorter periods of time. What were the reasons for that? Was it ideological or practical, or why was there a difference in terms of how that panned out in the North? And then my second question is maybe a controversial one, which is that I know that, Sean, you presented, you know, the undermining of testimony by the women in the Commission's report in kind of historians' methodological kind of framework, and that is why there was a difference in terms of how the Commission produced its report. Is it not also possible, and do you think that this may have played a role, that this is simply down to good old-fashioned misogyny? I mean, we have a long tradition of women being dismissed, being disbelieved, and so forth. And I just wonder whether you think basically a gender bias, if not even, you know, a conscious one, played a role in that. Thank you.
I can take the first one, Sean, if that's. So thanks for your question, Tara. I'm not sure that, I don't think we ever found anything that explicitly stated why this was the pattern that had emerged in terms of stays. I think there are several things that feed into it. I think often because of there was a greater sort of, I suppose, a tradition and a move or larger of institutions of that sort of idea of a separate baby home and children's home, that again, the children, there weren't the mother baby homes were relatively small, and they didn't have the facilities to keep children, which is part of it. So they were being moved to, if they were being moved to an institution, to a separate baby or children's home. For example, somewhere like Marionville, you know, the baby home was just across the road, so there was a sort of convenience there to that aspect as well. Also, the 6 weeks, in terms of the 6 weeks for consent for adoption, does, I think, play a big part. That was sort of the time scale that people were working to, that after 6 weeks, you would decide what you were going to do. Either you signed the form for adoption, or had there been a change in circumstances, might you be able to take a baby home, or, you know, was there an interim? Was it going to foster care? Was it going to an institution while decisions were being taken? But I think very much that 6 weeks and the sort of possibility of adoption played a large role in babies. But again, I think it's a lot of, doesn't seem to be, and it's the same for across the range of the homes as well. It's sort of, you know, across the varieties of them, they're not kept very short, but and that bigger move and the bigger concentration and focus as well on children's homes and baby homes and separate institutions for babies then as well.
Thanks for your question, Clara. Yeah, I think your reading of things could be entirely appropriate, obviously, and I think a lot of people have made comments along those lines. I suppose what we didn't want to do today was to sort of set ourselves up as some kind of critiques of, you know, the the rival operation, if you like, across the border. You know, that we're better than you, and look how clever we are. You know, we don't want to make those kind of points. And I suppose particularly as you know, as we said in our last question, we felt that we were not heavily interfered with, but that was partly because, you know, we didn't have this massive bureaucracy around us potentially. So I'm not quite certain what level of committees would have been going through that report and preparing it. And that, as I said in my section, they certainly seem to have followed this general stylistic issue where there's a concession about the obsession with confidentiality means that, you know, no one's words get even attributed to a pseudonym, you know, so it's always another woman said, or so this woman said, and it's never even Mary, or as we use kind of initials, you know, so AB or BC told us. So at least you can follow BC's story through the report and see what was BC's story and what happened to her, when did it happen, and, you know, how traumatized does she appear in terms of the testimony, which is revealed in to a large degree. So I think so. It does seem to be methodological, but driven probably not from a historical perspective, but by the state's perspective. And I think that's where you're right. Obviously, the kind of misogynistic tendency, and you're completely right in terms of, I mean, what's totally bizarre about the commission, but more so I think that McAleese report, is that you get to page 17 before you hear from anybody in whose interests the report has been established. I mean, that's absolutely bonkers, isn't it? You know, so yeah, I mean, you know, if I was doing this outside this context, I probably would be more critical. But, you know, I think myself and Leanne also, having done this and having sweated over this and having been fearful about the response to it, and what if we get it wrong, we don't want to, you know, join in any kind of kicking of the report in the Republic, at least not too obviously anyway. Hopefully that's a reasonable answer.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Clara. Next question is from Ewan Duffy.
Afternoon, everybody. Sean, Leanne, well done on your report, and don't be afraid to kick the Commission's report in the South of Ireland. Feel free, even though they're fellow academics, etc. I won't give you plaudits on your report based on the Commission's report in the South, because I don't think I'll be very fair to you, given what happened with it. I've a few questions here, and some of them run into the same sort of context, but would you say this research here in the North would have been preferable to be done as an essential part of an actual state investigation, rather than a standalone prerequisite for this so-called state investigation that we're hopeful to have in the future, given the fact that the people affected here were excluded from the HIA, and the fact that Dr. Sean Lucey did a scoping exercise on the same issues back in 2014, which came to a lot of the same conclusions as yourselves, although yours was more depth. And also, in terms of contracts for testimonies, would I prefer to say that it would be better for them to be forwarded out to anyone given a testimony in the days and weeks leading up to a testimony, rather than on the day? Was there any counselling that all of the witnesses give their testimonies? Another question: should authors of government commission reports be made accountable post-publication to a government or victim survivor forum, or both, regarding the methodology, findings and the recommendations of any such report? And could you say how many drafts were written of your report before final publication, and when did you become aware of the maximalisation process, given that we're aware that that process started a year in after your report was handed into the Department of Health? The last one, last two Good Shepherd sisters, on page 370 of your report, the authors, being yourselves, said that the two Good Shepherd nuns who came forward faced their own personal trauma in coming forward to defend their own orders from their accusations. Do you think that's a fair and equitable statement to be making, given the trauma faced by victims and survivors? And lastly, how can government commission reports be carried out robustly without legal and police powers, especially given the actions of Family Care Society in your report, their conflicting past, and the fact that they basically marked their own homework? Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Unan. Okay, quite a lot there. Not sure I caught it all, but I'll have a go. Sean Lucy, I suppose. So I think your point there is that this is all taking a lot longer than it needed to take. If you're going back to Sean Lucy, and then you're going now to the next stage, which is going to be whatever comes out of the independent panel looking at suggesting how an inquiry should take place. You know, I can't disagree with those people who have suspicions that, you know, some of these things are dragged out because there are reasons, which might be financial, it might be the interests of a whole range of individuals or organisations to drag them out. I can't disagree with that, although I can't demonstrate it to you kind of factually. You know, I can also see that it's sometimes about the bureaucratic process, which is not very efficient, you know, and I've seen evidence of that. I think we've all seen evidence of that in the different organisations that we've worked with over the years, potentially. Counselling, no, there was no counselling, and we were disappointed about that. You know, we wanted there to be counselling. There is counselling in place now for those individuals who came forward, but that wasn't part of what was part of the offer at the start of the day. And, you know, there was just a here are the kind of contact numbers and what have you, and that certainly wasn't. I don't think that was very impressive in terms of the Department of Health's position on this. How many drafts? I don't know. Quite a few. I suppose what I will say, Unan, is that part of that process of redrafting did enable us to keep adding information as we found it, and we found quite a lot of useful information after we'd done the first draft. So it did become more compelling, I think, in the redrafting process, and we didn't take anything out that, you know, was no kind of like smoking guns or whatever were removed in any of those drafts. Maxwellisation, I don't think we heard that term Maxwellisation until whenever it was, as you say, 12 months after the submission. But I'm pretty certain we were aware from the start that, you know, we weren't going to write something that wasn't going to go before some kind of scrutiny process. You know, we'd assumed probably at that point that it would be the lawyers of the Department of Health that would be having a look at this, and that there might be some right of reply for these organisations. We didn't know from the start, I think, what the Maxwellisation process would entail. Again, I think, although that was a highly frustrating process at the time, and it took a lot of time, that neither me or Leanne will get back. I think it did help us to make it a lot more solid, the report, you know, so it wasn't totally a waste of time, or, you know, it did prolong things, of course. Was it right to say that the Good Shepherd sisters had experienced their own trauma? Well, I think it was, Unan. I mean, you know, I'm an oral historian, and you know, I can see that, you know, I interviewed those two women, so you know, I could see that they were struggling with aspects of what was happening around them. You know, I think they come from a different culture, they come from a different, you know, they have a different kind of mindset than others, and they have a different version of reality, a different version of history and truth than you know, victims and survivors have. And you know, I think it was a traumatic process for them as well. I wrote those words, so you know, I'm not saying I'm not going to sort of take them away. I wouldn't want to take them away, I don't think. And I compare them, you know, at least they came forward, at least they came and gave us an interview. You know, there were other organisations who didn't present us with anybody, and there were other members of organisations who possibly knew the research was going on and didn't come forward. They could have, you know, they could have hidden. They could have, you know, hidden behind, you know, all kinds of reasons and not given us an interview. So, you know, I would stand behind that, I think. Have I missed anything out, Unan?
Just basically, how can government commissioned reports be carried out robustly without legal and police powers? You faced those same frustrations. I was under the impression, and I have communication saying that legal powers were in place at the very start of the report process, and obviously that wasn't evident or actioned throughout your report. So that's a bit confusing. And obviously, seeing your interim report where 6 months into the report, you had already at that point stated that none of the Catholic institutions had cooperated in terms of disclosing records, etc., etc. So that inevitably led to a lot of problems with the process, you know. And of course, you've stated that Family Care Society, given their conflicting past and present, basically looked and analysed their own records and then handed them over to you then for your analysis based on that. So that's a bit like the state investigating itself, which is wholly inadequate and unacceptable.
Well, I mean, Unan, all I can say is we've been totally open about this in the whole process in terms of the report, and you know, you're now able to cite all of this, and that's because we've been totally transparent from day one about the kind of cooperation we were getting. And cooperation sometimes means very speedy cooperation, and at other times it can mean constructive delay, I think, you know, and it's never quite clear when that is happening. You can't be absolutely certain it's happening. Certainly we felt that we had a lot of overlong delays, and we spent a lot of time with various meetings and discussions, and there were ways in which we were made to do the research that delayed what we could do, and have lessened what we can do, lessened the impact that we've had. But I still think we've had a pretty major impact. As I said at the start, for 12 months and £186,000, I think we've given the victims and survivors a report that gives them a lot of detail, gives them a lot of information that they didn't have, and gives Phil and Maeve something to work with going forward. And, you know, I mean, I don't know what you think, but I mean, I think those two are an absolutely amazing appointment for the independent panel. I don't think you could have found, you couldn't have picked two better people than that, I don't think, could you, Unan, from your perspective?
No, the only problem being, Sean, that obviously there's a social worker who's leading that truth recovery panel. We would see that as a conflict of interest. And of course, that truth recovery panel was floated as an idea, and it was appointed without the knowledge of victims and survivors. So, you know what I mean? There are a lot of problems with process here. When victims and survivors have been told, especially going forward now, given what's happened in the past in the south and the north, that victims and survivors will be central and they will lead, you know, it's a complete dichotomy that and an oxymoron when you get all sorts of appointed processes without that victim survivor consultation, and more importantly, the participation. You know, one of the first questions that I had asked you when I met yourself and Leanne way back at the start of the process was that victim survivors need a representative in the process of archiving and research, where we could stand over, we can see what access the academics are having access to, and that we can report back. Like, we're well fit and able and capable of signing the same Official Secrets Act, non-disclosure agreements, etc., as everyone else. The difference being that we can then refer back to, as advocates, to the people that we represent and say, we know what's been accessed, we know what the researchers are looking at, we know what's been handed over, we know what the government are looking at, and we know what's potentially being held in storage and is not going to go back to these institutions and then likely to be potentially destroyed going forward. That will absolutely, you know, mitigate any potential full disclosure and truth, you know, going forward, which is where we're at here. You know, Robin Swan has, all he's been able to do is basically write to these religious institutions and say, can you please not destroy the records that the academics had access to? And you know, these religious orders, etc., have proven that these people, we cannot appeal to their better nature, because there's been too many arsonists and destruction. You've seen that so many records of your own that you've had access to are not being kept in the proper conditions. you know what I mean, in terms of archives. And all of these things are extremely problematic going forward. You know, we know what happened in the south, and especially with McAleese and the records that went forward to McAleese, all of the records that have been kept in the Taoiseach's department in the south of Ireland, and nobody's having access to these. So these are all problems that need ironed out going forward. But we're hoping to be learning the lessons from the past. But despite what happens recently and going forward, certainly the government don't seem to be taking any lessons, you know, on board as to the problems that there's been in the past and even the most recent past, you know.
Okay, I take your point. I think that might be the stage of victims and survivors representatives having a role in looking at the research in the future, and, you know, as you say, having sight of what's being examined. I think that's something that certainly Phil Scraton has done in the past with, you know, the Hillsborough independent panel. So I'd imagine he'd be looking at models like that for the future. So you may well get what you're looking for there, Unan. I mean, it wasn't something that we could offer you, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Unan.
Okay, Una, thanks very much for your questions and your perspective. Do we have any other questions anybody wants to ask? Now's your chance if you do. Okay, not seen any other hands go up, so I think maybe we'll finish there for, or we do, sorry. Clara, do you want to come back again? You have another question?
Sorry, just one very quick question. And just because trauma has been mentioned a few times, I'm wondering about the role of trauma on the researchers. And I'm just sorry, my daughter has just snuck into view here. I'm just wondering, you know, how you have dealt with doing the work that you're doing, basically. Thank you.
Do you want to have a go at that first, Leanne, and then I'll come in on it?
I think both Sean and I have said in numerous occasions that it's been the hardest piece of work that we've ever done, and I think when we did say this in a meeting of the interdepartmental group, I think they were a bit sort of taken aback, you know, by that. And I know Sean can speak to about the sort of the oral history aspect, because that has sort of different, I suppose, implications as well to the archival side of things too. And the researchers, John and Livy in particular, you know, were having to look at material that was very traumatic a lot of the time. I think one of the things that was very important was that we were all able to talk about it. That as a research group, we were able to kind of you know, it gelled very well, and we're able to kind of bring all those issues together and talking through, you know, what the sort of what we were reading, and also the sort of the difficulties often in process as well. So I think the fact that we were able to do that, you know, really helped, and that was sort of really important in terms of being able to offload all of those issues and sort of having to do that. But it was incredibly intense, and I think the period of having to, you know, writing about things that were very difficult, and so difficult, not to take away anything from the people who experienced those, but again, it was something that I think that was very difficult and for us doing that. But again, I think that group dynamic and having that support there was very important.
Yeah, in terms of the oral history side of the project, I suppose we were particularly lucky to have Livy D, who's we mentioned earlier. Livy was the prime oral historian. She did most of she did all the oral history interviews with the birth mothers and many others as well. And so myself and her would quite often have to have you know, the kind of debrief around, you know, what have you been listening to this week, and are you okay? And, you know, there are quite often like text messages and things just to check in, you know, how was the interview today? Everything fine? You know, do you need to talk about it? But you know, it was very, very difficult at times. Obviously, I think Livy bore the heavy lifting in terms of the most traumatic testimony, obviously, with the birth mothers and birth mothers' children. I think for myself, the kind of most dramatic time was actually doing something a bit more, it sounds mundane, but it was actually, well, it's two things. One, it was going around cemeteries looking for the graves of women who'd been in Magdalene laundries. And secondly, it was looking at the death certificates for women who'd been in Magdalene laundries to try and identify causes of death and to see, you know, if there was anything that required any kind of investigation. And when you have a big pile of death certificates sitting on your desk for your day's research, you know, that is quite a troubling kind of experience, I think. And I think, you know, that it was things like that could get quite challenging at times, you know. But I think we had a good dynamic as a group. I think, you know, Friday night drinks were always interesting because everyone would be sending photographs of what they were drinking on the Friday night, you know, so it was a way of joking and unwinding at the end of the week and sort of trying to take the weekend off and think about something else maybe for a few days. But yeah, it was tricky, Clara, and as Leanne says, it was the hardest thing I think we'll ever do in that respect.
Okay, Clara, thank you very much for that question. I think we're at the end of our time, so I'd like to just wind up by thanking everyone for participating this afternoon and asking such great questions. It's a very difficult subject. It's been expertly addressed by Leanne and Sean. We've learned a lot from the presentation today, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to carry the conversations forward. People want to take those conversations forward individually in the aftermath of this seminar. Could I ask you all perhaps to unmute yourselves and to give Sean and Leanne a round of applause to show our appreciation for them sharing their research with us today.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Sean and Leanne. We really appreciate it. And just before everyone goes, we do have one last Irish Studies seminar in our series in 2 weeks' time on the 10th of May. We have Ruud van den Beuken from Nijmegen University in the Netherlands, who'll be talking about radical drama in the Irish Free State at the Gate Theatre in the 1920s and 1930s. So if that's a topic of interest to you, you'd be very welcome to join us for that and just pre-register through the normal Eventbrite channel. Okay, so thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and good evening.
Thank you very much.